Hello, welcome back to What Now? On the threshold of life, death, and grief. And here we are in the studio with my friends and colleagues.
David Kennedy
and Red Keating.
And I'm Julie Brown. And it's the three of us here today with a new friend to us and a friend to the podcast with Sharon MacLeod, joining us today from Quebec City. Welcome, Sharon.
Good morning.
Morning. Sharon, just by way of introduction, sometimes I read out a bio of people, but we thought it might be nice just to step into this conversation with just having you share a little bit about yourself, just so our listeners can get to know you.
Sure. I live in Quebec City in the province of Quebec, and I've been here for 20 years, which seems amazing to me that it's been 20 years already. I married a Quebecer. I grew up born in Virginia, but grew up in California area. He was working as an engineer, my husband. And we met and had our first child in California, and we decided to move here for a number of reasons. Anyway, we moved here, and our son at that time, named Alexander, was 1 year old. And we established, and I eventually got my license, and I eventually started working, but not as a nurse in obstetrics, because I found that French was nowhere near as easy as I thought to learn, especially when you move and try to learn a language at the age of 40 to 42 when we moved here. Anyway, so I ended up having a wonderful job that I basically kept the whole time we've been here. I've been working as a school nurse in the English school systems. So I, by choice, gave up my specialty, but it's turned out to be an incredibly great job. I since had another child here in Quebec named Leah. So I had two small children and opted to take in Monday through Friday, no nights, no weekends, no holidays, just a sort of a normal run-of-the-mill, wonderful job. And it turned out to be a great job because it's very community-based. I ended up meeting many, many Anglophone people here in the city. Still, we're sort of embarking on that time in life where I'm wrapping up anyway, my career, and thinking of moving on and doing other things. And so we go back and forth between what to do, what after all of these are said and done. And that's me in a nutshell.
Sharon, you've generously agreed to join us today to speak about your son, well, all of your family, but specifically about your son, Alexander.
Yes.
And just before we began recording today, we were asking, is it Alex or is it Alexander? Maybe we can even just start there, that you were very specific about what his name is.
Well, I always thought the name Alex was really nice, and everyone can spell it and everyone knows how to say it. And so I thought, well, Alexander, it's a great name. He'll be called Alex. And then when I started to call this little baby Alex, my husband said, his name is not Alex, it's Alexander. So I went ahead and respected his request, and he remained Alexander even when he was 8 pounds and something ounces, and all the way to the end, he was Alexander. Except,
can you introduce us to him? Can you tell us about Alexander?
Sure. Extremely bright from the get-go. I saw very early on how alert, and he saw little bits of humor easy on. He was very, very active from a real early start, clearly a thinker and a curious, very, very curious mind. And it was really embarrassing that I would just have to say, you know what, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure what the answer is. So when Daddy gets home, we'll talk to him about it and we'll see. And so most of the time that would work out. So very, very outgoing, very bright, curious. He was very, very handsome, a cute, beautiful little boy. Of course, every mother says that, but he really was beautiful little boy. And people just really gravitated towards him because when he walked into a room as a little toddler, he captured a lot of attention. Because he was captivating. He was charismatic and charming. From a parental perspective, he was so much work. He was intense all the time. Intense. He didn't take no for an answer very well, just really difficult. We ended up taking him to a child psychologist at some point when he was, I don't know, maybe 1.5, 2, because he had these night terrors. The psychologist said, he's a very normal boy, but I can see that he's extremely bright. It's going to take a lot of good parenting skills. And then he said that these children are the ones who become the great adults. There's a greatness in them that I see in him. So I thought, oh, okay, well, that's wonderful. Okay, I guess we'll just keep moving on and keep moving on, although it didn't give us the skills. But these were, by the way, before we became really aware of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Before we became, not that we weren't aware, but it wasn't as big of a subject as it certainly is today, and easily accepted and medicated and so on and so forth. So we didn't really think too much about that. And we also didn't think too much about another subject that seems to be so much more present and aware, which is anxiety. We understand now and believe now that he had just so much anxiety. I'll give an example. You would say to him, "Oh, Alexander, we're going to go to Disney World." And he would say, "Disney World? Why would we do that? I don't want to. What are we going to bring? How are we going to get there?" Most kids would, "Oh, Disney World," whereas he would resist it. So I think he lived with a lot of anxiety that we just didn't understand at the time. So he was very, very big, bigger than life.
So it sounds like he had this brain that was working all the time, that even in something benign, like we're going to go here or there, it's like his brain was always trying to kind of get out in front and think about all the other aspects to that.
Exactly. I think he had the hyper intelligence that his father has, but he also has a lot of traits that I had, apparently, according to some stories, clear indications of anxiety as a child too. I don't think it was ever anything that needed to be pathologized, but according to some of the stories, sure, I showed some traits of having anxiety too. I was a very hyper active, intense child as well, but under different kinds of more normal at that time dictatorship parenting, authoritarian parenting. There was no room for a child to express themselves. So you did what you had to do. Whereas we were, the modern age parents. So why are you feeling that way? Well, what do you think? We parented him very, very differently than we were parented, which I think most people say. So we were open to who he was and what he was doing and why he was doing it. And I can remember when he was about 3, 4, still toddler-ish age, I remember thinking to myself, and I didn't share this with anyone, not even my husband, anyone. I remember thinking, this has got to be such a hard way to live with that level of intensity. I questioned whether he was going to live a long life. And I actually imagined, what if I find him at some point killing himself? What if he takes his life? And I imagined him dying by suicide at some point in his life. And that was when he was a really small child. Because of his level of intensity, I thought that must be really hard to live with.
Yeah. So it's like you were just aware of the suffering that he likely was experiencing even at that very young age because of his wiring.
Exactly. And I think that I had those thoughts, of course, in times when he was suffering, not when he was enjoying all of he was not a child who was always suffering by any means, but when he suffered big and, big. And I remember, of course, as a parent, I had so many emotions because I was trying to maintain order. I was trying to calm the situation. I was trying to do all the things that a parent might do. And of course, I was often angry. I was often frustrated. I was often confused at what to do. But those emotions, at times, definitely when I saw the situation, I thought, my goodness, he must be suffering. And how can he live this way? How? And actually at the time that he after he died, I did confess that thought that I had as early on, that I had those intuitions, shall we call them?
Yeah. No, and those are fascinating pieces of story that we have heard as well. I have heard that from that intuition piece, and you're afraid to say anything, obviously. And in fact, at the time, you hardly want to admit that you're thinking it. But it's amazing to me how many times I've heard that story that way.
I have heard parents who are dealing with, in fact, I just about a week ago had a lovely luncheon with a fairly new friend, and we were talking about some of our we immediately bonded and talked about, we shared some stories. And she also had those thoughts, but it was more because it was a fear that she had at the time that her son was a young adult teenager going through a lot of drug addiction issues. Whereas I was having those thoughts as when my child was a toddler.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever heard that before.
Yeah.
The parents even had those intuitions, but of course I never talked about it because I didn't want to have a set of premonition.
Yeah.
Well, I think that speaks to the level of intensity. Like, you can use the word intense and everybody has a definition, but that takes it to what, that I think that helps us understand the true level of the intensity in which he lived his life, even as a young toddler, that you were able to sort of have that internal feeling and that internal thought that this is more than intent. This is intensity times whatever. Right.
Exactly. This is not just your typical normal. I didn't feel anyway that it was your typical normal toddler temper tantrum. And I was told many times, oh, Sharon, don't worry. This is a normal temper tantrum. And I remember even at one time feeling shamed by it. I had a person in my life, we had sons who were about the same age, and they were maybe around 11, 12. And I was really struggling with some of the issues with him and parenting him. And I remember this mother saying, oh, Sharon, just leave it alone. He's perfectly normal. I felt shamed by my worries.
Right. So you're holding this deep intuition, just knowledge of your child, as Red said, like just with awareness of the intensity with which he's living his life. And then the outside world is saying, why are you holding those worries? Why are you being almost kind of like paranoid or something like that? But your knowledge, your own knowing was guiding you somewhere different with that.
Right. Yeah. Which unfortunately leads after the death of a child who you've had those feelings with, leads to a very complex grief process.
Of course.
Very complex grief process. I suppose most of us, guilt is the obvious feeling that you have as a parent of a child who has died by suicide. But yes, I think that when you have a child at such a young age, you have these concerns and but you're still doing your best. You're moving on. You're going to psychologists. You're going to, and everyone is giving you the information that, oh, you're great parents. Just keep doing, you're great parents. Just keep doing what you're doing. Even it's now been, it's 7, almost 8 years. It'll be 8 years in the beginning of May. I don't belabor the feeling of guilt by any means. And in fact, I've been pretty good about just brushing it aside and logically trying to say, well, you shouldn't feel guilty. It's so on and so forth. But I have sometimes, and this might be controversial, and I might make some people very angry by saying this, but I have thought many times how much easier it would be if my child had died by disease instead of by suicide. Because by disease, there wasn't nearly as much choice that the parents would have made. But by suicide, boy, that's so much more complex. And I've actually even only begun to touch on the complexities of his death and the leads up to his dying.
Right. Let's step back there in terms of that intensity and Alexander is growing up. What was it like for him as he entered into this sort of maybe the teenage years? That intensity, bringing that forward then into the role or the job of a young person to sort of separate and differentiate themselves from their parents. But what was Alexander like then?
Well, that's when we started to get into real trouble, actually. I would say about 1.5 years before he died were the worst times of my life because of how difficult it became with him. It's interesting, as a nurse, I just received a magazine. One of the articles that it's featuring is how cyber addiction is the new dependency of this century. That was ultimately one of the big causes of the problems that we had with him. So he died just after he turned 15. He was only a month beyond 15. He was very young. we had put him into a program, a school program that was highly regarded, required entrance exams. It required all the students had to have a laptop because it was very technology based, and it was really a great program. So he was 12 when he entered the program, and he was a master with that laptop, a master, and he loved it, and he did really well. But he also learned how to play games on it, and it got really bad. His grades started to slip. I remember really clearly him meeting me at the door. It brings such sadness when I think about it. But he one evening he met me at the front door, waiting for me to come home from work, and he said, "Mom, I'm way behind now. I'm way behind. I need to get caught back up again." And he was tearful, and so he did. He worked really hard. So he would have been in what we call secondary 1, which is grade 7. He would have been 12. He worked and worked, and he cried and cried and cried, and he worked and worked, and he got caught up. But that was the point where he actually probably started to develop the cyber addiction that we didn't even have a formal diagnosis for at that time. And so we, of course, started to be aware of it, do screen, trying to monitor the screen. Well, it spiraled so badly that I will summarize and tell you that it spiraled so badly that we were afraid of him because he cared about nothing more than his laptop and playing games. He fought hard and long about the restrictions that we tried to place on time on the computer to have fun. We had to sit him in the dining room to be able to monitor his screen so that we could be assured that he was working on schoolwork. It was a nightmare, a nightmare. Eventually, we even had to call the police at one point on him because he threatened violence at my husband for shutting off the Wi-Fi. He was going for the knives in the living room. It was horrific. We had the department of the what's called the DPG, the Child Protective Services, let me put it that way, ended up becoming involved. It was horrible. All I can tell you, it was horrible. We ended up being relieved that he was pulled out of the home at one point. He was placed in a facility. Ultimately, he was put into what's called a group, a foyer de groupe, which is a group home for boys, where he was placed with all kinds of restrictions. And we were terribly, terribly relieved because we were worn out. We were parents who were exhausted. We were worn out. And
probably, it sounds like afraid for your own safety. And I'm imagining for your daughter as well.
We were, yes, we were. If you can imagine a year and a half of all these struggles, he slammed me against the wall at one point when I made a conscious decision at one point to react to a shocking moment where he called me names that I never imagined in my life my son would ever call me, because I wouldn't let him have a cookie because we were getting close to dinner time. It sounds so silly, but that's what happened. So I consciously said, this is a moment where I will slap him in the face for calling me, his mother, what he just called me. And that's when he slammed me against the wall. I never thought that could ever happen in my home. So yes, I called the social worker at the school. We decided to place him temporarily in a different facility. And he was at that point only maybe going on 13 or so, very, very young. But yes, at that point, I was becoming afraid of him. I likened it to what it is like, what I have heard it's like with someone who's extremely addicted to really hard drugs. They don't care about anything. They become even alcoholics. They become, my mother was an alcoholic. They lose their ability to have empathy with the world around them oftentimes because they become so fixated on their addiction. And he was very much like that.
Right.
He didn't care about anything. And I felt it. We felt he didn't care anymore about us.
Right. It sounds like not only Alexander, but everybody in the family was almost held hostage by this addiction, right? And by his, we'll call it behavior. And once it becomes aggression, everybody then walks on eggshells, and then everybody is subject to or subjected to that feeling of being hostage inside their own home.
That's exactly what it was like, Red. It felt horrible, like a hostage. So when he first was taken out of the home and placed in this other home, I think I cried off and on for about a week during that period of time, until I decided as a mother, I'm going to use a different strategy. I'm going to let him do what he wants, which means let him have all the screen time he wants. Let's let him fail. Let's see what he does. But I couldn't stand to have my child leave the home,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
even though it was what was recommended by the professionals who were helping us. I couldn't tolerate that I would have my child move out of the house, and that he knew that we, as his parents, moved him out of the house. So yes, it was pretty tough. But then, of course, when he came back home and we reestablished new rules, he thought, oh, this is wonderful. And of course, it went even worse. It got even worse. He was put into the teenage psychiatric hospital for a little while, and he was put into another facility. It got really awful.
And during that time, Sharon, was there a pretty consistent concern about suicide?
Very, again, complex and interesting question. He was also at some point informally diagnosed, and I say informally because you can't write on paper a diagnosis of a teenager because of all the issues they might be going through. There are strong suspicions, of course, but narcissism was what we're told that he probably had a narcissistic personality. So I remember looking up narcissism and suicide. Do they go hand in hand? Of course, I thought about it many times, but when he was placed in the final place where he was in, they have to visit it all the time, the subject all the time, and they did not. And we discussed it. And they said, no, he's not showing any signs. He never discussed it. I didn't ever flat out ask. And again, another guilt issue. I felt that my role was during that point in time, I really wanted to be always loving, always open. We love you. We want the best for you. You can come home anytime as long as you blah, blah, blah. So my role was really to be a loving parent, to not be the punitive parent.
Yeah.
So we really relied, I think, on the professionals to guide us. We do recall, though, my husband and I, when he would come home for visits from when he was placed in a separate facility that was much more of a punitive facility. Anyway, so he would come home and he told us that he said he learned from one of the other adolescents who were placed in this facility that he could hang himself by tying something on the doorknob and hanging himself from the doorknob. And we thought, we heard him talk about that and say that. And Alexander was always pretty open. He talked a lot about a lot of stuff. So I didn't think a whole lot of it, but I didn't forget it at the same time. Mm-hmm. And that ultimately, by the way, is how he killed himself at the home,
at the facility.
But he killed himself because he got into an argument with a staff member. He had smuggled in a laptop somehow and was not supposed to have had the laptop. And they tried to take it away from him, and he escalated. And prior to that point, he'd already been living there for about 4 months or so. Mm-hmm. Prior to that point, he'd been a role model, follow the rules. He was happy to be there because he was able to finally get back to school. The threat was that they were going to be sending him back to the facility that's semi-punitive prison type facility. That's very, very restricted. And he wouldn't be going to school anymore. He would be in school and in the facility where he had been threatened. Yeah, he didn't really belong there because from all of the professionals level, because he was a, like educated, intelligent, upper middle class kid with great parents who were always there. And like he didn't belong. And he felt it, he knew it, and others felt it. So he was severely bullied there. So that was one of the reasons why they moved him on to a group home, which was actually a great decision. But anyway, so that, of course, created a huge, huge issue that he wasn't in our home. He was in the guidance of the Child Protective Services. Mm-hmm.
How was it, Sharon, that you were informed? Do you remember that time?
Yes, clearly, like it was yesterday. My husband and I were home. It was beginning of May. It was a beautiful spring-ish day. And we received a phone call from one of the administrators at the facility. And actually, it was not even one of the ones we knew. It was someone higher up who said that, oh, Alexander had gotten into an accident, but wouldn't give any details over the phone. We need to go to the hospital. So our thoughts were, oh, what the heck has he gotten himself into now? It never occurred to us that it would be as serious as it was. And when we got to the hospital, we didn't see Alexander right away. We were pulled into a little room, and the emergency room doctor came in to tell us that he had attempted suicide and that it wasn't looking very good. They basically kind of warned us that he's on a ventilator, he's not responsive. They did a beautiful job, because I got to say, it didn't leave me with hope, but at the same time, it didn't leave me without hope. It was that middle ground where you don't know what to think, what to do. So we were able to go in and see him. At some point, he was then transferred up to the pediatric intensive care. So we were able to see him transferred up to the intensive care. And then we were told that we should go home, that there was nothing at this point that we should do. And so we went home and came back right away the next day. And we had our daughter. So we had to be sort of, oh, Alexander's in the hospital. We're not sure what's going on. We're going to go back to the hospital. So we took her to school. And anyway, that was not easy also, because you have to be a parent to another child as well.
Yes. Yes.
So we were with him by his side. So that was a Wednesday, but he was not declared brain dead until late into the evening on Thursday night. So that was his, yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
So then, interesting enough, I, as a nurse, always talk to my children about organ donation. So I knew that Alexander was okay with organ donation. So when we got the news that, yes, he was brain dead and that he's not going to make it, so then they had immediately and beautifully so, they asked us what we thought, and we immediately said absolutely, and told them that we even knew that Alexander wanted that. And at this point, yes, we had told Leah what was going on. She was aware. And Leah was, by the way, at that point, 11 years old. So she had come to the hospital. She had seen him. Then at the end of the evening, Thursday night, we were told it was just a waiting game at this point as to how long. And that was painful to think that he would be kept physically alive.
Yes. Yes.
But fortunately for everybody, he was kept physically alive until we got a phone call at 6:00 the next morning. And got the wonderful news that they were able to find donors. Two separate individuals to receive his kidneys, and another donor to receive his liver. So that actually brought a little light into the situation. Yeah. Yeah, to know that we gave life, he gave life to 3 people.
A very unnarcissistic thing to have done.
Yeah. Yeah. But that really did help the grief, believe it or not. It really helped the grief. And as I mentioned earlier, having been really involved with big communities and theater, and we had a lot of support during that time. The people who we consider our best friends here, also we met through theater. With the help and the support of all of these community people, we had a celebration of life. That also helped a lot with the grieving process too, the immediate grieving process.
And the grieving process changes over time. What do you remember about those first months, year or two, Sharon?
Well, I remember being very concerned about, or very, very aware of, and concerned about how different my husband and I are, and how we are so very different emotionally. And I wanted to make sure that I was always okay with that difference. I didn't want to put my grief and my trajectory of how I was going to deal with this on my husband. Because the statistics of divorce after a child dies, I believe it's much higher than the normal statistics of divorce or separation or whatever we do as couples. So I remember really wanting to be okay with whatever we did. He's not an outwardly emotional person, and I am. He's not a talker, and I am. He's not a crier, and I am. So I let us do our different grief processes. I do have to share a story with you. I received a message from an acquaintance, not someone who I have ever been friends with or close to, but I certainly knew her and I respected her. She contacted me within a few days after Alexander's death. I responded and I said, yes, what is it? And she said, well, I'd really like to talk to you. And I said, are you, well, and then she really stressed how important it was. So anyway, I finally did get on the phone with her in private and we spoke. And she had the most unexpected, interesting thing to say to me that made a huge difference for the immediate meaning months of grief for me. She said that, very apologetically, that she didn't want me to share this with anyone, but she has the ability to speak to people who have passed, who've died. And she doesn't like this about herself because it's a burden. And she said that Alexander approached her and she said, go away, Alexander. I'm angry with you for doing that, for taking your life. I don't want to. She pushed him away, his spirit away. And then she said that he was so insistent, which I can so easily imagine Alexander being so insistent.
There's that intensity.
And doesn't take no for an answer. And it's his way or the highway. Absolutely. She said, Alexander, I can't right now. Come back tomorrow morning. I'll be alone. Come back tomorrow morning. And she said that he came back. And he said, I want you to give a message to my mother. He insisted that she write it down so that she can remember what it was he had to say. And the message was basically that he was sorry for how angry he always was. And that he's okay. He doesn't regret his decision. And that he was okay. That he's not a lost and suffering soul. That he's okay and that he's sorry for having been so angry. And I shared it with my husband, who did not buy into any of it, which upset me. Quite a few months later, I did share it with Leah, our daughter, who really appreciated it and took it in. I'm not a religious person. And of course, she could have dreamed this and made it all up and dreamed it. I know she wouldn't have ever done it in any way to be harmful in any way. I'm certain of that. The fact that she was so very apologetic about interfering at the time was, I think, interesting. But the fact that she stressed how he said how sorry he was for his anger, there's no way she could have known that. There's no way she could have known that. Of course, some of the other things, I'm sorry, I'm doing well, don't worry about me, I'm not a lost soul. Those are maybe more cliche things you might expect. But the fact that he apologized for his anger, and he was angry with us. He was so angry with us. I brought up the story about the letter because it really helped me tremendously. It helped me write the mother's eulogy. It helped me be at peace. And then in some ways that does fade as well.
Yes. Yeah.
It fades.
But it sounds like it gave you something to hold on to in those early days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It meant it was a huge relief.
Yeah.
Because when you're a parent and your child dies by suicide, when what you want nothing more is for your child to grow up and be well,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not, you've failed.
Mm-hmm.
Which I don't believe intellectually.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I of course went to I remember doing grief therapy with a psychologist, and I could see that there was nothing more that there's nothing really more to. Well, I question this now that it's been almost 8 years. Do I have more work? I honestly think the work is never done.
Mm-hmm.
The work is never done.
Mm-hmm.
But yet I'm very happy.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm a very happy person as I sit here sobbing and with Kleenex. I'm a very happy person. How ironic is that?
Mm-hmm.
But that's grief.
And that's who we are as humans also, and how grief moves through us and we carry it over time, that hopefully there does become room for other of the range of our human experience and feelings. And yes, we still sob for our child that's no longer here. And it sounds like you have a really full and beautiful life. And in the way you introduced yourself today, like really meaningful work, and really feel part of a strong community there. And yet, of course, this will always be here. Yeah.
Exactly. It will always be here. And I think in his case, that's why I think it was important to explain some of who he was. So thank you for asking me about that as well, because that has a huge factor on the grief process as well.
Yeah.
I cannot say that and I didn't say in his eulogy, I didn't say that he was what you always hear, oh, the brightest, the kindest, the loving, the most giving, he was not. He had amazing potential and was amazing in many, many ways. But he was also not in many ways amazing. He was selfish. He was cruel. He made us afraid of him.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want him living with us. It was very complex, which is why sometimes I think, gee, if he were, again, maybe a controversial thing to say, but if he were a child who had died by disease, the complexities wouldn't have been quite so much. The fact that he was so complex as a person, but yet, yes, had so much potential that you never see that potential.
Yes.
You never get to know.
Mm-hmm.
Would he have ended up as an addict in prison and a miserable narcissist? Or would he have matured and outgrown it and seen it and understood it and done good things with all of the talent that he had? We'll never know.
That's right.
I was going to ask you that. How do you see him now? And when you think of him, is he still 15? How do you envision him at this point?
Well, in my conscious day-to-day, unfortunately, I still see and think of the Alexander that was 15 and caused us a lot of harm and a lot of grief. But I dream about him often. And I dream about him as a young boy, as that, wonderful, cute, intense, everybody, he captivated people because he was so good looking and because he was so cute and bright. And when I dream about him, I dream about that little boy. And I think that's maybe part of the the never-ending grief as I think about, I dream about, and when I say dream, I mean literally dream. In my dreams, I'm loving him all I can, which I think is part of the guilt as well, because you can't help but wonder, did I not love him enough? Because he was so intense and required so much, it was always getting negative at the same time, which was really, really hard as a parent, because you want the positive to outweigh the negative. So, we were, as parents, we were always trying to do our best to be, those good parents that we thought we were and wanted to be. But in my dreams, yes, he's this wonderful little kid that you're still hoping you can shape and form. But yeah, in my conscious, I still see him as he was near the end, and that's sad. I wish that weren't the case. So I guess the grief just goes through so many phases, and sometimes I've actually thought about, well, maybe I need to go back and see a therapist about this, because maybe I'm not in a good place in the grief. But then again, what's normal, what's not?
Right. Then we try to imagine what a good place is, and then
exactly,
as opposed to where we are. And I imagine part of certainly the last few years of Alexander's life, it would have been a little difficult for him to establish a lot of close friendships that because of his moving and things. But I'm sure, now you watching perhaps some of his friends from younger years as they continue to grow and find their way in life, that you're looking at them thinking, oh, wow, they get to do this. And
absolutely. We live in the same street. We all moved in. The neighborhood was developed around 20 years ago. So all of these people with tons of young boys in particular, and a lot of them at all around the same age, and they'd all hang out together, and they'd all play together and fight together, all those things. I see them now. Most of them are still around. I see them with their cars, and I see them tall and handsome and walking to the bus stop, or working at the local bank just down the road now, and having just about finished up with university. And yes, of course, I wonder, would he have done that? Would he have ever overcome his struggles? And at the same time, I know parents who have children who did not overcome a lot of the really horrible struggles, and they are now living well into they're now living later with their children now being in their late 20s, and they're still suffering over their children who are alive but not doing well and struggling. And as horrible as it is to say, the struggle, I lived it so heavily and so deeply and so painfully that I don't want to be in their shoes either. Isn't that, I mean, that sounds like a horrible thing to say, no. And I used to say that. And when Alexander died, I had started grieving him before he died. We had lost that little boy before he died. And we worried and like crazy, what's going to happen to him? Because we saw zero self-control. Ultimately, it was because of a fight over a laptop that he decided to take his life. So we worried about that. We worried, boy, how many years is this going to have to go on? And we started to kind of figure out what are we going to do as parents with a grown adult, or how are we going to detach? So I talk about Alexander's death and grief, because it isn't just, oh, this wonderful child who's taken his life and died. It isn't simple as that. It's this complex person who created so much harm in our lives at the same time, but who we loved more than he loved himself.
Yes. Yeah. We hear that.
I was going to ask, when you meet people for the first time, perhaps who are going to be part of your life in some way as friends or acquaintances, And the inevitable question comes up about family. How do you respond about how many children you have, etc.?
That's a great question that just came up not that long ago. When Alexander first died, I wanted to make it a point to not hide that he died by suicide. For a number of reasons. I didn't want it to be taboo because I think people need to understand suicide. And when something come up, I would just simply say, oh, we lost our son to suicide. That's what I say. We lost our son to suicide about 7.5 years ago. And he was only 15. And, of course, people react and they, but sometimes I don't care to have those discussions. And that's what happened to me not that long ago. But the worst part that I remember, and I'm sure any grieving parent would remember this, when you run into people who are not your close friends out and about, and you run into them, and you have to, how's Alexander, how's Leah, and then you have to drop that bombshell. It's never that it was hard for me because of me. I hated that I had to impose that heavy bombshell on them.
Yeah, that's a very tough situation to be in, and a difficult one that parents struggle with. And as I would say to parents, you're the keeper of the story. You don't always, not everybody needs to hear the story. Not everybody has the right to hear the story. That's yours story, and to treat Alexander with that respect, and that's why I know we all are, we talked about this before, but we're also deeply thankful for your courage to allow us to hear that story today. So deeply appreciated, Sharon.
Oh, thank you, David. Thank you, Red. Thank you, Julie.
We have the three of us often talk about our own experiences and how we would describe the gift of being story listeners. And we all refer to what we call sacred space. And this has very much been sacred space today, and honoring that in you and your story. And it's just been such an honor to be able to sit here and listen and be grateful. So thank you.
You're very welcome. I hope that it gives some relief to those listening to it, that they might have some of the same feelings, worries, to be okay with that it sometimes has moments of joy, to have relief. All of the feelings that we as human beings don't always own up to, but that grief is very, very complex, and it's a life process. It never goes away. It just evolves. So thank you for letting me share my story.
Thank you for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough, dedicated to providing compassionate care and support to individuals and families facing life-limiting illness and loss. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio in Peterborough, Ontario. Special thanks to Paradise Garage for providing the music. Technical support is by Sean Heichert, and audio engineering by Kevin Fleming. More episodes of What Now are available for free on most major podcast platforms. If you found value in our conversations, please support us by following the show, leaving a 5-star review, and sharing with your friends and loved ones. If you'd like to support the essential work of Hospice Peterborough, please consider visiting hospicepeterborough.org/donate. Your contribution helps us continue to provide vital care and support. Until next time, may you find peace and comfort on your journey.